How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boy Lie Hobby Time. I had an idea to turn this posable figure into a custom cowboy action figure, and let's just say that the build did not go as I intended. But I did end up with something in the end that I rather like. I believe these little blank figures are primarily used for reference for artists, but I wanted to try my hand at making some custom clothing, some weapons, some gear, and everything else in this scale. I also wanted him to be realistically posable, so that's why I went with one of these. I was going through different poses in my head as to how this one lone cowboy could be standing. Decided that I wanted to plan on him holding a rifle slung over his shoulder, and maybe his hand ready to grab his revolver. I watched a video from Lapsus Mental Works where he wrapped some cling wrap around an action figure followed by some masking tape to get the shape of the clothing in this scale. After wrapping the tape around the figure, mark out the seam lines with a Sharpie and cut along those lines to get the patterns for each panel of fabric. The process worked exactly like he said it would, and I ended up with appropriately sized clothing parts for both a shirt and some pants, which I transferred over to some wax paper. I knew the templates could be applied to something other than fabric, and I didn't feel like learning the skill of sewing for this video, so I opted to have less mobility and more sculptability by going with Epoxy Sculpt, which is an off-brand version of Epoxy Sculpt. I peeled an evenly sized lump from each container of epoxy clay, and I kneaded them together until they were one solid color of gray. The reason I went with the epoxy clay as opposed to a polymer clay is that I don't need to bake it in the oven, which would definitely melt the figure underneath. I sprayed some mold release into my pasta roller because I heard that epoxy clay is far stickier than polymer clay, so I ran that through to get some nice thin sheets that I could use for the panels of fabric. I then cut out pieces of clay into the shapes that I had marked out onto the parchment paper and began sticking them to the action figure's body. And it was at this point that I kind of realized I had lost the vision of making an action figure. Now I was just making a sculpture, and would have been far better off using an armature rather than my relatively expensive body coon figure. Some armature wire and aluminum foil would have been far more cost effective. But oh well. And while the figure may be trapped in an epoxy tomb forever, at least he's not naked anymore. After getting a bandolier, a belt, some belt loops, some boots, and a few other details in place, I added some bullets to the bandolier. I cut up a bunch of equally sized pieces of a styrene rod, placed them side by side on the bandolier with one more final strip of clay across them all, which I pressed into position using a sculpting tool. After the bandolier was done, it was time to move on to the head. I covered the guy's face in a layer of clay and began building up the facial structure. While this figure underneath the clay is lean and muscular and young looking, I wanted this character to be old and weathered, so I sculpted the face accordingly. I took off my gloves, which is probably a no-no, but it was far easier to work with all these little details without the gloves on. I added some facial hair at the end and then stuck the head back onto the body, and in the process I smushed his brow and forehead a little, but I gave him some ears, which made up for it. The head looks a little bigger than I had hoped, but that's partially because the shoulders were slouched. I should have straightened out his back and given him better posture before putting his clothes on. I carved out the brim of the hat from a thin sheet of styrene using the same method that I used in my last video to carve perfect rings out of styrene. I covered the styrene in clay and sculpted the rest of the hat directly onto his head. After the hat, I gave this guy a holster for his side arm and a poncho which I hung over his shoulders. And then I went back and removed half of the poncho because, as we all know, cool guys tend to wear their poncho over just one shoulder at a time. At least that's what it says in the How to Be a Cool Cowboy Pocket Handbook. I freed up the end of the poncho with some scissors, and then it was time to move on to what might be my favorite part of this build. I used some balsa wood and little pieces of styrene, which I sculpted and carved to make a tiny lever action rifle in 1:12 scale. Looking for an excuse to make 1:12 scale tiny weapons was actually the original inspiration for this build. Unlike my 1:1 scale rifle, I left all the tech off because not every weapon in the Wild Imaginary West has those upgrades. It's all dependent upon the owner of the weapon. In this case, the special ammo that this guy uses is made to be more effective at scaring away monsters. Unlike many of the people in the West, he's not out here hunting for trophies. I had a great time making this little rifle, out of styrene and balsa wood, and it definitely inspires me to make more stuff in this scale. I slung the rifle over his shoulder with a strap leading to his left hand. After that, the cowboy was basically done. I left that to cure overnight, and when I came back to it, I did want to do something to bring him more into the wild imaginary West, because as of right now, he looks like a normal guy. So I decided to give him a staff that was also a cool piece of tech. Originally, I was going to use styrene, but then I switched to some metal bits from K&S Precision Metals, and I soldered them together instead of using glue, so that it was nice and sturdy. I used a file to get rid of any of the excess solder between the pieces, and then I added some tiny tubes to the staff to give it some extra character. I added 4 little rings to the front of the staff, and the idea behind this thing is that it is charged up with high voltage stored in a power bank near the center of the staff for balance, and upon engaging the weapon, the end of the staff acts like a powerful taser for just a few seconds, giving the user an opportunity to stun the creature, if timed correctly, and make their escape. I added a guitar string power cable to connect the battery to the front of the staff, and then I used some styrene to hold that in place. I then placed that into one of the interchangeable hands that came with the figure, and that was my cowboy done. With the cowboy finished, it was time to clean up my workstation and move on to the next step, which is of course the base. I grabbed some XPS foam from my scrap bin, which I cut to match the size and shape of my gesso board. The idea I had for this diorama was to imply the presence of a monster without having to actually build a monster, so I took one of the pieces of XPS foam and I sketched out a giant bear track. Because contrary to what Hollywood would have us believe, bears are actually very dangerous. I burned away that section of the foam so it had a nice dip to it, and then I carved away the edges of the rest of the foam. The next step was to add a terrain paste, and because I wanted to do a little sculpting, I used some Sculptamold. I mixed the Sculptamold up to the recommended ratio, and then I spread it over the foam with my gloved hand. After the foam had been covered and the Sculptamold had some time to sit for a minute, I used my fingers to press the footprint of the bear into the recessed area that I had burned away with the torch. My fingers worked well for the large areas, but for the claws I used a sculpting tool. Then I pressed the man's boots into the still soggy Sculptamold to leave his footprints as well. I then covered up the rest of the pink surfaces, and while that was drying, it was time to paint the man. I took him outside and I primed him black, and then I began the painting with a light tan zenithal highlight from the airbrush. And while I paint this guy, I'd like to establish a little bit more lore and also give a shout out to all of my patrons. If you've been watching my Wild Imaginary Western series for a while, you've probably seen this guy before, in previous videos. His name is Leo. Leo is an old trapper, hunter, prospector, and general outdoorsman who's been wandering the West for decades. He seems to be known by everyone in the different towns across the country, and has acquired many tall tales concerning his travels and his motives. Not all the tales are true, but he's definitely considered a legend of the West. Leo no longer chases the things that he did when he was young, like gold and trophies. For the better part of the last decade, he has been on a mission to find and observe the largest wildlife of the West and compile what he's observed in his journal. He now gets his thrills by getting close to the large animals and the most dangerous creatures, observing them, writing down their behaviors, habitats, making some sketches, and living to tell the tale. He's currently in pursuit of a golden bear. His journal is a personal project and he never intends to release it publicly, but maybe someday someone will find it and publish parts of it. I finished painting Leo, and then I waited for the base to dry, and when it was finally dry, I textured it with some mud effects from Vallejo. I wanted the ground to look like it had been soft enough for a footprint to be left in it, maybe right after it rained, and now it was mostly dry and easier to walk on. I did take the base outside to prime because I didn't want the acrylic mud effects to be impacted by any of the following steps. I painted the base with a dark muddy brown and went overboard with my final earth color, which I wasn't so happy about, so in order to bring that back to a place that I liked, after it was dry, I covered the whole base with a burnt umber oil wash. I was much happier with how it looked after that. To sell the idea of this being a soggy footprint, that maybe has collected some rainwater, I mixed up some green soggy mud watercolored UV resin and I applied that to the bottom of the footprint. I started with a protective layer that I brushed on, and then I began adding layer by layer until the footprint was filled to a level that looked good to me. Once the Giardia green water had been fully cured, I added some static tack, followed by some static grass from Woodland Scenics. I vacuumed up the excess static grass to save for later, and then once the base was dry, it was time to apply some black 4.0. I am going to do a black 3.0, black 4.0 comparison at some point, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about it. The last thing to do was to add some pins to Leo's feet and stick him in position, and after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.